Finally, I wanted to talk a bit about the reading by George P. Kanaqlak Charles, anthropologist and Yupik man, and his the reading that you did called Cultural Identity Through Yupik Narrative, which I thought was really interesting. So he talks again about that emphasis on his family's knowledge and that he's not trying to make sort of universal claims about Yupik culture. And I think that's interesting. I think as a Yupik anthropologist, he's kind of implicitly speaking to other anthropologists in the way that to do our job, we sometimes kind of make sweeping statements to try to help other people understand cultures. And so we'll say things like, well, in Navajo culture or in Yupik culture, but he's kind of taking a very different approach as a Yupik man who's trained in anthropology and kind of saying, yeah, I'm not going to try to speak for my entire people. I'll speak specifically for my family, kind of as a case study, and not try to say whether or not that's true of all Yupik people. Although in doing so, he teaches us a great deal about Yupik culture through the lens of his family. So it's an interesting way of talking about cultural knowledge. And I think, there's value in learning those types of patterns. Again, that kind of relates way back to what we were saying before about evidential markers and this sort of, the way I've heard it, kind of pattern in Yupik speech. And I think shows us sometimes that learning cultural patterns can help us better understand the choices and experiences of our neighbors. So knowing that about Yupik language kind of helps us make sense of Dr. Charles's writing. Anyways, he has some very interesting information in that about stories that he had heard about inter-regional warfare among Yupik people. And so specifically, he points out that for a very long time period, Yupik people, even prior to colonialism, had been living in peace, and he talks about that was because of Kanaqlak, a mythical hero, by which we mean a hero from a sacred story, who had brought peace, who had taught his people that war was destructive and was not a good use of time and resources and life. But he said, there are stories about wars way back when, and so much way back when that they're sort of more mythic than anything at this point. But he says, we could learn about Yupik practices through those stories, and he talks about, for example, that people would have tattoos. This is very, very long time ago. Again, this wasn't even prior to colonialism, traditional Yupik culture, so much as it's sort of traditional Yupik cultures have stories about a time where Yupik culture was like this. But there would be dietary practices related to warfare between different Yupik communities. And so people would, for example, be fasting while going to war with the idea that by not drinking very much, they would have somehow more endurance. Specific kinds of food that would be eaten, like a specific kind of egg that would be kind of kept in your lip and you would slowly suck on to kind of give you strength. And the idea was to make warriors as strong and fast as possible with these practices. The women would oftentimes breastfeed their children within the men's communal house with the idea that would make them better warriors. So this emphasis on the strength of male warriors. And the wars were typically not between villages, although that could happen, but more so between entire villages of Yupik people. And at least as Charles is describing it sounds to me like what I would call a vendetta war rather than an expansionist or interventionist war. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes when we talk about major wars between entire nations, we have wars that are expansionist, where a nation's trying to gain new territory, wars that are anti-expansionist, when a group is trying to push back against that and not allow its territory or its allies' territories to be taken, or interventionist in the sense of regime change kind of wars, where you attempt to change the political structure of a nation that you're at war with. By contrast, the stories that you read about in the Charles reading talk more about wars as kind of vendettas, right? So one of the examples was the boy who was blinded by another boy, and then the father was furious and attacked the boy that accidentally blinded his son, and then this led into a situation where the village took sides and eventually into the entire region and led to a giant battle. So that's what it sounds like, but I don't know enough about Yupik warfare to say that they're always based on vendettas, traditionally, but that was the idea. And again, I want to emphasize that that's not to say that there was this type of warfare going on when the colonizers showed up, so much as that there were stories about times of warfare that had happened even earlier, which I think is important to emphasize because it shows us that native nations had historical change long before colonialism. So we've talked a lot about the rapid changes that happen as a result of colonialism to people's cultures, but it's also true that native nations were changing before colonialism. It's not as if they're these like stagnant cultures that never had change, right? New technology gets invented, as we've talked about before, new customs, new religious stories become developed or enshrined, and in this example, people go from having a lot of warfare apparently early on in very early Yupik culture to then entering a period of relative peace in later traditional Yupik culture. So traditional culture is not one thing. That has changed over the millennia as well. As Eric Wolf pointed out, we sometimes think that Native people are a people without history. That is not the case, right? There is extensive historical change. It wasn't like the Americas were just sort of this timeless thing where everything always looked the same. And that's important to recognize in recognizing the humanness and agency of indigenous peoples. Okay, well, it's also important just to acknowledge imperfect stories. So I appreciate kind of Charles talks about the fact that from his point of view, particularly as a Vietnam War veteran, he says, I really think war is a really destructive thing. I don't know that he would characterize himself as a pacifist, but certainly somebody that, like most of us, doesn't care for war, doesn't think it's an ideal situation. But at the same time, he shares these stories and says, this is part of Yupik cultural heritage. And so I think there's a value when we talk about our cultural heritage, whatever that may be, native or not, to acknowledge both the positives of our heritage and also things that might not be so positive, and to be fully honest kind of about the histories that we have as peoples. That's kind of the only way we can learn from history. All right, well, thank you so much for your time today.